But you going back from Wounded Knee to the Marias River, to the Washita River, to the Sapa Creek, to the Slim Buttes, to the Sand Creek, to the Horseshoe Bend, to the Tallahassee River. You going back to the Mystic Massacre, you going all the way back at an uninterrupted string of massacres and scalp bounties and dislocations and reductions of population, liquidations as they called them in Europe, all the way back to an outfit called the Wappingers. Well, they didn't call themselves the Wappingers. But if you heard of them at all, it would be by that name, because that's the European name, the name that Europeans put on them to record them in history. But they're not much talked about because what happened with them is not too convenient. And we don't like to talk about what's inconvenient in this country. In fact, we want to, I don't know, take people, tie them to a stake, burn them up for saying wrong things. Okay, you'd be accused of white bashing when you talk about what white people do. You'd be talking about being anti-American when you talk about the history of the United States. Knowing something about it is considered unpatriotic. Wappingers. Could probably actually find a name, but I've never encountered it and don't know anybody who knows. They're pretty much lost in the midst of history. And these are the guys, you all heard about them, I'm sure, in grade school. These are the silly Indians that sold Manhattan Island to the Dutch for a handful of beads and trinkets. Silly Indians. Manhattan Island. Tell you what, they said that was about $50 worth of beads and trinkets. We'll pay you about $50 billion to keep that monstrosity you've created on Manhattan Island. We want the land back, but not that. Okay? No, these are those very little Indians of Americana. Okay, so the little Indians sold the island. No, they didn't. They rented the tip of the island to the Dutch for trading purposes because there's a mutual benefit. Trade had things like bladed weapons, iron pots, glass beads, trade cloth, things the Indians didn't have. These are trading people. They had things the Dutch didn't have but coveted, beaver pelts, for example. But in order to engage in this commerce on an irregular basis, the Dutch, who were from somewhere else, needed to have some place to set up, so the Indians rented them some land. The Dutch being, oh, you always mispronounce our name, so let me return the compliment and say of a very European persuasion, decided that since these are inferiors, they would simply pass off this rental agreement as a bill of sale. When the Indians objected, they solved the problem. The way they solved it was by rounding up the militia, sending them up the island to dispense with the Wappingers, which they did with remarkable efficiency. So efficient that they didn't believe that they would believe when they came back. When they came back down to New Amsterdam, as they called it, they didn't believe that the townspeople would believe they'd actually done it. Oh yeah, sure. Now we'll have to deal with the Indians again next year. So, in order to document their achievement, they took the heads from the recognizable males, the ones that were prominent with whom people at New Amsterdam had dealt, or who at least they'd seen. They took their heads and they produced them in town, said, yeah, we've vanquished the Wappingers. Basically, we've annihilated them, and here's the proof. And there was a joyous upsurge of sentiment among the populace. And they were so happy, they celebrated, and they celebrated by having themselves a sporting contest, jolly little game of kickball, using the Indians' heads as the balls. Produced them in town, said, yeah, we've vanquished the Wappingers. Basically, we've annihilated them, and here's the proof. And there was a joyous upsurge of sentiment among the populace. And they were so happy, they celebrated, and they celebrated by having themselves a sporting contest, jolly little game of kickball, using the Indians' heads as the balls. And that little kickball contest happened at a location which is very nearly the foundation of the World Trade Center. Military economic interlock as a matter of state has been the nature of this project we now call the United States since before the United States ever existed. Doing this to other people is the absolute fundamental requirement of what it is that becomes the United States. That whole process of what was done to Indians in terms of liquidation of population and divestiture of land and resources was the absolutely essential ingredient of placing the United States in a position to where it could project itself outward in the world in the same fashion it had projected itself inward to consolidate itself as a continental bloc country, a mega state as it were. There's no distinction to be drawn in terms of form or motive between what it is that the United States is doing in Iraq today and about 30 other places on the planet, and what it's been doing throughout the 20th century abroad, and what it was that it had to do internal to the North American continent in order to create the capacity to do that. Inside and the outside are inextricably linked. It's a single, uninterrupted process. Now, all of those people from all of those massacres and all of those scalp bounties and all of those dislocations and dying of disease from smallpox infection that was deliberately induced in California, in the upper Missouri, in the Ohio River Valley, and elsewhere, they were all there. They were all there on 9/11. These were all unrequited deaths, actually even celebrated, because that's the orthodox historiography. American historiography is ultimately triumphalist. It is the same kind of history you could expect a victorious Germany to have written about itself in the aftermath of the Second World War. Germany, however, was not as smart as the Nordic population of North America, as Hitler called y'all. It lost. That's the big difference. Germany lost, the Nordics here didn't. Other than that, well, we can parse differences all day long, but it's the commonalities which are actually ultimately at issue. And it doesn't end with the Indians. Those foundations of those buildings, the World Trade Center, sit roughly, as those of you who have been to New York probably know, roughly at the foot of something called Wall Street. Wall Street, which takes its name from the enclosure of the slave market, which gave rise to the New York economy. No, slavery was not something restricted to the Deep South. It was in the North too, and it was very profitable to trade in human flesh, chattel laborers, livestock, in other words, drawn out of African civilizations. And so the U.S. portion of the transatlantic slave trade would also be at issue. Those people who died in the Middle Passage en route to North America, with the markets in New York and Charleston and elsewhere, and those who were brought here too, because for their own civilizations, for their own cultures, their own societies, they were as good as dead. They weren't killed, and that's the big distinction that the exclusivists will tell you. Well, this wasn't really genocide because they weren't killing them. In fact, they had a vested interest in keeping them alive as much as possible because they were valuable and they wanted to work them, they needed to labor. Didn't matter back home. Once you're taken across an ocean and pressed into chattel slavery, never to return, you might as well be dead. The impact on your culture is the same.